well, welcome everyone to our fall literary lecture series hosted by the Antrim Literature Project, an online public humanities platform that aims to make the study of literature accessible to readers beyond the paywalls of the university. We're happy to offer this series of free introductory lectures on a variety of literary topics. You can find all of the recorded lectures on our database at antrimliteratureproject.org. We have the pleasure tonight of hearing from Abigail Scott Rawleigh. Abigail is a PhD candidate in early American literature at the University of Notre Dame. Her research explores the intersection of religion and literature in the early modern British Atlantic. Her dissertation project looks at domestic language, themes, and the real spaces to which they correspond in 17th century religious poetry, considering how colonial poets adapted, revised, and otherwise invented domestic language and imagery in conversation with their metropolitan counterparts. We're looking forward to this lecture of hers tonight, which is titled Reading Poetry with the Puritans. Thank you, Abigail. Over to you.
Thanks, Adam. It is a pleasure to be here. Let me figure out how to share my screen. All right, I think you should all see it there. So thanks again to Adam and the Antrim Literature Project team for putting together this wonderful lecture series. It's been so fun to hear from so many people over the past weeks, and great to know that it may continue for one more week. So at some point in this, I say something about this being the last lecture, so it's not. Just keep that in mind. Tonight, I'm going to share a bit about New England Puritan poetry with you. We'll look at a handful of poems, beginning with The Day of Doom, which was an early colonial bestseller, to get a feel for Puritan aesthetics and style. Then we'll look at some examples of funeral elegy, a popular Puritan genre. And if you remember from last week, elegies are poems written to lament the death of someone. Finally, I'll conclude with a few other examples of more complicated Puritan poetry. During this talk, I'll ask us to consider both how the poems were written, how they're composed, and how they might have been read, thinking about content, form, and the experiences of reading, or more often than not, listening to poetry. I hope that you'll leave this lecture with some key things to look for in Puritan poetry, and maybe even an interest in reading more on your own. All right, let's see if the slideshow will work. So since this is almost the last lecture of the fall series, I thought what better place to start than at the end of the world. Concern over what comes after death, eternal life or eternal damnation, was a question that animated the most popular poem in the English colonies during the 17th and 18th century. That was English colonial minister Michael Wigglesworth's 1662 poem, The Day of Doom. The poem, some 224 stanzas in length, did much to shape the imagination of colonial Puritan New England. The Day of Doom was read and memorized widely, treated sort of like a catechism full of memorizable Christian truths to which Puritan faithful could turn and recite whenever they needed a reminder. The poem was so popular that even though it went through many, many printings in Old and New England, only a handful of early copies survive because they were read to shreds. So if you can see kind of in the bottom of this cover page, this is a 1701 edition, which is pretty late. That's almost 40 years after it first appeared in print, but it's one of the earliest copies that we have surviving. So let's dive into the poem and take a look at the first few stanzas as a bit of an introduction to New England Puritan poetry and the things that we'll continue to think about tonight. Still was the night, serene and bright, when all men sleeping lay. Calm was the season, and carnal reason thought so 'twould last for aye. Soul, take thine ease, let sorrow cease, much good thou hast in store. This was their song, their cups among, the evening before. Wallowing in all kinds of sin, vile wretches lay secure. The best of men had scarcely then their lamps kept in good yore. Virgins and wise, who through disguise amongst the best were numbered, had closed their eyes, yea, and the wise through sloth and frailty slumbered. For at midnight brake forth a light, which turned the night to day, and speedily a hideous cry did all the world dismay. Sinners awake, their hearts do ache, trembling their loins surpriseth. Amazed with fear by what they hear, each one of them ariseth. They rush from beds with giddy heads, and to their windows run, viewing this light which shines more bright than doth the noonday sun. Straightway appears, they see it with tears, the Son of God most dread, who with his train comes on amain to judge both quick and dead. That's the first four stanzas of the Day of Doom. And it always kind of reminds me of 'Twas the Night Before Christmas, though here the stakes are much higher. It's not whether you'll receive Christmas presents. The world is ending, the eternal state of your soul, whether you'll make it to heaven or be damned for all eternity, is what's at stake. So if the rhythm of the lines, the patterns of stressed and unstressed syllables and line length sound familiar to you, that's because this is written in a ballad meter. This sort of metrical pattern is common in hymns. You might know of Amazing Grace. And while Puritans wouldn't have sung hymns in church on Sunday, they would have sung psalms in a similar meter. The whole book of Psalms, commonly called the Bay Psalm Book, was first printed in the colonies and is the biblical Psalms written in a ballad meter, what they call English meter on this cover page here. Simple and unobtrusive metrical patterns like this were popular among Puritans because they wouldn't distract from the didactic meaning of the poem, the lesson or truth the poet was trying to convey. In fact, simplicity is a key feature of Puritan poetry in general. Some of you might be familiar with the term Puritan plain style. This term is really a broad generalization of Puritan aesthetic style, but I'm guessing if you've encountered New England Puritans in a previous literature course or maybe your own study, that term has come up. Plain style is a rhetorical mode that's straightforward and to the point. It doesn't rely on complicated metaphors or flowery language. It's accessible to a general reader or listener. In the case of Puritan sermons, it might follow a logical structure. But the thing about plain style in poetry is that simple language and form, like the familiarity of ballad meter, counterintuitively doesn't mean a lack of complexity. Importantly, while the base psalm book used the same metrical pattern, that pattern was also commonly associated with secular ballads, like the songs all men sung at the tavern the night before in the second half of this first stanza. We could put quotation marks in there, which some later editions do. Soul, take thine ease, let sorrow cease, much good thou hast in store. This was their song, their cups among the evening before. So by using ballad meter in this poem, Wigglesworth is referencing both sacred and secular traditions. The psalms, and then also ballads that might be sung as drinking songs or just for fun among a group of friends. On top of that conflation of sacred and secular, Wigglesworth references a handful of biblical passages just in these first two stanzas that, because of the high literacy rates among colonial Puritans, he would have expected his audience to pick up on. So I've highlighted these. Oops, too far. I've highlighted these. The ones in blue are what would be glossed in the margins in later editions, like the one that we saw from 1701. And then the ones in yellow are just things that came up as I was reading these first two stanzas. And maybe some of you who might know the Bible have other references that you've thought of too. To make things even more complicated, because the Day of Doom served as something that was memorized and rehearsed, sort of like a catechism, it would have been read in the context of Puritan family devotions. When Wigglesworth's poem begins in a domestic setting, then, people are sleeping in their beds, he's referencing the very place in which folks are likely to be reading this poem. That makes the fourth stanza even more powerful. They rush from beds with giddy heads and to their windows run. I half wonder if readers and listeners to the poem might have peeked out their own windows just to be sure they didn't also see the Son of God most dread coming down from the sky to begin Judgment Day. After this dramatic opening, the rest of the poem is a series of dialogues between God and sinners on the Day of Judgment, as God metes out punishment for wayward humans, and they try to come up with reasons for why they ought not to be damned. Spoiler alert, the sinners always end up damned. Wigglesworth's popular poem highlights the ways in which Puritan poetry is plain, He's not using complicated image or dense language, but it also highlights how that plainness has within it a complexity of allusions, contextual clues, compressed meaning, and a balance between sacred and secular associations. Reading and rereading as a process of meditation are key to reading the Day of Doom. Those layers of the biblical allusions in the first two stanzas might not stand out on a first reading, but on a second, third, maybe even fourth reading, you can unlock a term Puritan theologians and writers of manuals for devotional practice often use to describe the process of reading for spiritual development, more and more meanings latent in the poems. So I definitely don't have time to get into the nitty-gritty of Puritan religious doctrine or politics in this lecture, but it's helpful to have a bit of that context to understand the way in which the poetry works. Most importantly, it's important to recognize that Puritan is a little bit of a catch-all term for English churchgoers, ministers, and lay people who felt the Church of England's break with the Roman Catholic Church in the early 16th century was not complete enough, and who followed a theological system known as Calvinism, named after the French reformer John Calvin. Puritans argued that the English church needed further reform to rid itself of Roman Catholic ritual. Because they were Calvinists, they also believed in the total depravity of human nature. That is, because of the fall of Adam and Eve, all humans are irreparably sinful. Irreparable, except for when God intervenes to effect his salvation through his grace. As Protestants, Puritans placed greater emphasis on reading the Bible directly than did their Roman Catholic contemporaries, but they also rejected the Protestant Book of Common Prayer, the liturgical guide for the Church of England that includes written out prayers. Puritans preferred spontaneous prayer and devotion, and while my dissertation argues that their religious practices were never really without ritual, Puritans at least like to talk a big game about rejecting set forms of worship. But what of New England Puritans, the enthusiastic readers of Wigglesworth's Judgment Day poem? In the early 17th century, beginning with who we now know as the Pilgrims, English Puritans began to colonize New England. In 1620, these Pilgrims, who were Puritan separatists, pious Puritans who separated from the Church of England, sailed across the Atlantic on the Mayflower, establishing the Plymouth colony, which is kind of at the bottom of the map here. A decade later, a new group of Puritan settlers, these ones dissenters, who disagreed with some of what the English church did, but weren't ready to fully separate, started what would be a mass migration movement of Puritan settler colonists to the Massachusetts Bay Colony, which is a little farther north on this map. It's these Bay Puritans that we'll be mostly focusing on today. These dissenters wanted their church services to look different from the English state churches, but weren't willing to fully cut religious or political ties. So the map you're seeing here was drawn in 1616 by John Smith, yes, the famous John Smith, who coined the term New England for this region. I'm not sure how well you can see, and I tried to blow it up and it got a little pixelated, but in the bottom third, there's an inlet with the River Charles right around where Boston is today. And if you look closely, there are some structures there that aren't English homes, and there's even a tiny little person. So even though Smith's map is full of all of these English place names along the coast of New England, I want to be clear that while I'm focusing on English Puritanism in this lecture, the colonists did not arrive on the shores of an unpeopled wilderness, even though their poetry might sometimes make it seem that way. Indigenous peoples had been living and, of course, continue to live in what John Smith would call New England for millennia by the time the English arrived. English and Indigenous relations were tumultuous throughout the 17th century. Sometimes, as in the case of the Pequot War in the 1630s, fueling already simmering conflicts between Indigenous tribes, and also beginning conflicts through broken treaties and failed diplomacy, like in the late century King Philip's War. So this is just a map of some of the Indigenous tribes in the region that is southern New England. We're kind of in Massachusetts, Connecticut, Rhode Island area today. I think it's also worth saying, too, that most settler colonists in the 17th century still very much viewed themselves as English. Anne Bradstreet, who we'll meet more fully at the end of this lecture, says in one poem that she'll continue to write poetry as long as English blood runs through her veins. So while the New England colonies are sometimes viewed as ushering in what would become the United States, the colonists weren't really thinking of themselves in that way. So that's a little taste of the historical and theological background behind the Day of Doom. But what happens after death, how to live a life so that you're prepared to die well, these were questions that plagued early modern Christians as a whole. New England Puritans in particular were deeply concerned with the state of their soul and confirming that they would be among those who went to heaven after death because of particular concerns from their Calvinist theological heritage. Poetry for Puritans, as it was for many others, was a helpful way to navigate these questions. The death of neighbors, friends, and family members was a reminder of one's own mortality, but also a reminder of the new home in heaven that awaits the faithful after their death. So while it's not the main focus of the Day of Doom, the faithful Christians do go to heaven at the end of the poem, and they enjoy beauty indescribable. Here's one of the very last stanzas. O blessed state of the renate, O wondrous happiness, to which they're brought beyond what thought can reach or words express. Grief's watercourse and sorrow's source are turned to joyful streams. Their old distress and heaviness are vanished like dreams. Like the first two stanzas we looked at, the stanza is pretty dense. Because, as I said earlier, the Day of Doom was often read out loud, we might pay attention here to how the lines sound. Take just the first line, O blessed state of the renate. Renate means reborn, and it was already kind of an old-fashioned word for Wigglesworth's readers and listeners in the 1660s. Wigglesworth's rhyme scheme throughout the Day of Doom is that the second, fourth, and sixth and eighth lines rhyme. So he didn't need to use that word for the sake of that rhyme scheme. But there's an internal rhyme scheme in this poem. You can see in the first line, state rhymes with renate. And if we look at the third, fifth, and seventh lines, those lines that don't have a rhyming ending, we find the same pattern of internal rhyme. Brought and thought, course and source, distress and heaviness. And here is that mapped out. Wigglesworth actually carries this pattern of internal rhyme throughout the entirety of the poem. You might have even noticed it in the stanzas that we looked at first. That helps with the memorization because you know that there are multiple rhymes and a set pattern to the poem. But it also adds complexity because choices need to be made in words that rhyme internally and at the endings. So as we read this out loud a second time, pay attention to those rhymes, but also listen for the repetition of other sounds. O blessed state of the renate, O wondrous happiness, to which they're brought beyond what thought can reach or words express. Grief's watercourse and sorrow's source are turned to joyful streams. Their old distress and heaviness are vanished like dreams. So you might have noticed that there are a lot of S sounds in this stanza. Here they are highlighted. I think I got them all. This repeated consonant sound, which is called consonance, stands out to me in part because water plays an important role in the imagery of this stanza. We have grief's watercourse and sorrow's source, tears of sorrow that are turned into joyful streams. And I associate the S sound with the sound of running water, which maybe you do too. At the same time, when you make the S sound, especially in the words that end in double S's, happiness, express, distress, heaviness, the sound sort of slowly fades away at the end. It kind of vanishes like dreams, like the last line of this stanza. So there's a connection between the aurality of the poem, how it sounds, and the point Wigglesworth is trying to make, that sorrows of life will fade with the joys of heaven. And that's mirrored in the sound he chooses to emphasize in this particular stanza. So my purpose in zooming in on the minutiae of the sounds in this stanza is to show you how even though Wigglesworth is using relatively simple language, there's a lot going on aurally that lends itself to an effect on a listener. Reading Puritan poetry with an ear to the patterns of sound can help us catch the complexity in what might at first look like relative simplicity, and also help us see why Wigglesworth might have written a poem about Judgment Day instead of a prose narrative. The poetry requires the compression of meaning and attention to how it sounds. And this all works together to create something that needs to be read over and over again to unlock its full meaning. Repeated reading and meditation on the words were features of Puritan reading and religious practice. And this is an ideal poem to put that into practice with. So now that we've got a sense for some of the poetic strategies Michael Wigglesworth uses in the Day of Doom, which Puritan scholar Jeffrey Hammond has said defines Puritan aesthetics for the 17th century, we can turn to some other examples. We'll take a step back in time from the end of the world to preparing for death as an individual as we look at the genre of funeral elegy. So this is a self-portrait of 17th century colonial painter and slave trader Thomas Smith that hangs in the Worcester Art Museum in Massachusetts. I want to draw your attention to the bottom corner where we see Smith's hand resting on top of a skull. A memento mori, a reminder of death. This kind of imagery is pretty common across early modern portraiture. But kind of coming out or maybe being gobbled up by the skull's mouth is a poem. Here's a transcription, thanks to the Worcester Art Museum, because it's really hard to see in the picture. Why should I the world be minding? They're in a world of evils finding. Then farewell, world, farewell thy jars, thy joys, thy toys, thy wiles, thy wars. Truth sounds retreat, I am not sorry. The eternal draws to him my heart by faith, which can thy force subvert to crown me after grace with glory. So as far as we can tell, Smith wrote this poem himself. He's not transcribing someone else's poem. And this style of farewell to the world poetry is fairly common among Puritans, especially in journals and manuscripts. Smith rejects the good and the bad of the world in this poem and articulates this idea that I mentioned earlier, that salvation must be effected by God. The eternal, Smith writes, draws to him my heart by faith. God here, we might read as the eternal, drawing Smith's heart towards eternal salvation, the glory in the last line of the poem, through grace. So even in visual art, poetry was an important way of thinking about mortality, death, and the afterlife for New England Puritans. And I hope you're starting to get the sense that for Puritan faithful, death and Judgment Day weren't particularly scary. They were facts of life. In fact, for those of you who live in New England or visit the region often, the place you're most likely to encounter Puritan poetry outside of a literature classroom is in a graveyard. So this gravestone is in a burying ground in Worcester, Massachusetts. It's late 18th century, and I know it's really hard to see. It was super sunny that day. So I will zoom in to the very bottom where there is an epitaph, a poem. Friends and physicians could not save my mortal body from the grave, nor can the grave confine me here, when Christ shall call me to appear. So here in this epitaph, we find the deceased speaking directly to the people who walk by his grave, a reminder of their mortality, and also a declaration of his own hope that he would have life even after death. This poem is written in 2 couplets of tetrameter, meaning that there are 8 syllables or 4 metrical feet in each line. And this is actually another common ballad form and one that Puritans use across their poetry. So there's some continuity formally there. So this is Samuel Sewall, who is perhaps best known as a judge in the infamous Salem witch trials. But he kept a really thorough diary that tells us a lot about life in 17th and 18th century New England, and especially about funerary practices. Early New England funerary practices are really fascinating, especially at the turn of the 18th century, where previously stoic and solemn funeral services begin to incorporate things like gloves, scarves, and mourning rings as gifts given to the people who come to mourn. If that's interesting to you, I can provide some additional reading in my handout because I'm not going to get into that right now, but you can also go and read Sewall's diary firsthand. One thing that Sewall's diary really helps us to see, and that is relevant for our talk today, is the centrality of elegies for grieving practices in the mid to late 17th century. He mentions their popularity, describing how they were tacked to coffins or hearses during funeral processions. There's a short little poem that Sewall himself wrote. We might call it an epitaph rather than an elegy because it's pretty small and has that same sort of structure that we saw before. This morning, Tom Child, the painter, died. Tom Child had often painted death, but never to the life before. Doing it now, he's out of breath. He paints it once and paints no more. Sewall takes Child's occupation here, a painter, and uses that as the central conceit, that is the guiding metaphor for the poem. Child is a painter and often painted death. He might have painted some of the iconography used to decorate a horse-drawn hearse during a funeral procession, or maybe he painted portraits of dead loved ones for grieving families. In line 2, though, Sewall takes a theological term. For Puritans, as I said, death was a doorway to new life in heaven. Tom Child, now dead, had never painted to life before because he had never had the opportunity to experience the fullness of eternal life that death provides. In line 3, we learn he can only paint to life once because it requires death. He is out of breath. And in the 4th line, he paints death once and then can no longer paint anymore because his earthly occupation is not required in heaven. There's a lot compressed into these 4 lines, and it relies on double meaning and connotation. Painting here is at once literal and figurative, heavenly and earthly, spiritual, and it's also just Tom Child's day job. We've already seen the compression of meaning through form and allusion in Wigglesworth's poetry, but here we're seeing it through wordplay. How many different ways can we use the word paint? What various meanings can it convey? Let's turn to this elegy for Samuel Stone, who died in 1663, to continue thinking about this wordplay. Here, the author, who scholars think is Edward Bulkeley, takes wordplay to the extreme. So this is titled a Threnodiya. Maybe if there's a classicist listening, you can tell me how to pronounce that, but that's just another word for elegy, a poem of mourning. A stone more than the Ebenezer famed, stone splendent diamond right orient named, a cordial stone that often cheered hearts, with pleasant wit, with gospel rich imparts. Whetstone that edified the obtrusest mind, lodestone that drew the iron heart unkind. A ponderous stone that would the bottom sound of Scripture's death and bring out Arkans found. A stone for kingly David's use so fit, as would not fail Goliath's front to hit. A stone, an antidote that break the course of gangrene error by convincing force. A stone, acute, fit to divide and square. A squared stone became Christ's building rare. Bulkeley, like Sewall, makes most of his poem a play on words, and each couplet, those pairs of rhyming endings, take stone to mean something different. And they each try to highlight something about Samuel Stone's personality that's praiseworthy. Take the second couplet, for example. A cordial stone that often cheered hearts, with pleasant wit, with gospel rich imparts. Samuel Stone was cordial, cheerful, always had something pleasant to say, but never forgot to, with gospel rich imparts, those he spoke with. And my favorite couplet comes towards the end. A stone for kingly David's use so fit, as would not fail Goliath's front to hit. Samuel Stone was apparently trustworthy and steadfast, a stone that wouldn't miss its mark even when the odds seemed stacked against him. In the Bible, David, before he was king, famously slew the giant Goliath with a single stone in a slingshot. So wordplay like these 2 examples is something that we see across Puritan poetry. And because Puritan reading practices were ones of repetition, each time you read the elegy on Stone, you might meditate on one particular play of words. Something might really catch your eye or your ear, as the case may be. As both of these poems help us see, death was not just a time of grief, but of commendation, as the deceased found an even better home in heaven, and we remembered a godly exemplar on earth. What you might have noticed, though, is even when we get glimpses into Stone's personality, they're still pretty generic. He was kind, he was steadfast, he knew a lot about the Bible and could quote it. We don't know how many kids he had, for example, what he did for fun. Instead, the emphasis is on him as religious exemplar. In reading the Elegy on Stone, we aren't so much given a picture of Samuel Stone the man, but of the characteristics that make a good and pious Puritan. Jeffrey Hammond, who I mentioned earlier, describes these elegies as a microcosm of the Christian narrative. He writes that they make the Christian story, quote, more accessible because the redemptive story could be read in someone whom the mourners had actually known, end quote. The personal connection that readers of and listeners to the Elegy on Stone had to the man himself would have, the elegist hoped, generated a greater sense of the individual listener's sinfulness and need for salvation if they weren't living up to the model Stone presented, or if they were, generated a sense of confirmation that the promise of eternal life they had learned would be realized. They were truly following Christ. Okay, so let's take stock of the features of Puritan poetry we've discussed so far before turning to one final poem that we can close read together. We've unlocked Puritan plain style tonight, thinking about how even though the poems might use simple language and uncomplicated themes, poetic strategies like wordplay, double meaning, playing on connotations, an attention to how a poem sounds in meter and rhyme, and the compression of biblical, theological, cultural, and as we'll see in a moment, literary allusions all work together to generate a pretty complicated reading experience that requires multiple returns to the text. So I've been talking about a lot of religious poetry, and it's true that most Puritan poetry deals in religious themes. Their daily lives and faith were so closely intertwined that they're pretty much inseparable. But I want to turn us in our last few minutes together to a poem that's not explicitly religious and not really about death either, even though its author, Anne Bradstreet, certainly wrote a lot of poetry that explores her doubts, joys, and struggles as a faithful Puritan, and also wrote her fair share of elegy. This poem, however, was written to her husband when he was away on business for the New England Confederation, sometimes meeting with other English colonies, or the Dutch in New Amsterdam, or even going all the way to London. I'll read it at length, and while we won't have time to close read this whole poem together in full, you'll probably notice that it's pretty different from the popular genres we've been talking about. But we can still apply the same close reading strategies. Okay. Phoebus, make haste. The day is too long, be gone. The silent night's the fittest time for moan. But stay this once, unto my suit give ear, and tell my griefs in either hemisphere. And if the whirling of thy wheels don't drown the woeful accents of my doleful sound, if in thy swift carrier thou canst make stay, I crave this boon, this errand by the way. Commend me to the man more loved than life. Show him the sorrows of his widowed wife, my dumpish thoughts, my groans, my brackish tears, my sobs, my longing hopes, my doubting fears. And if he love, how can he there abide? My interests more than all the worlds beside. He that can tell the stars or ocean sand, or all the grass that in the meads do stand, the leaves in the woods, the hail or drops of rain, or in a cornfield number every grain, or every mote that in the sunshine hops, may count my sighs and number all my drops. Tell him the countless steps that thou dost trace, that once a day thy spouse thou mayest embrace. And when thou canst not treat by loving mouth, thy rays afar salute her from the south. But for 1 month I see no day, poor soul, like those far situate under the pole, which day by day long wait for thy arise. Oh, how thy joy when thou dost light the skies. O Phoebus, hadst thou but thus long from thine, restrained the beams of thy beloved shine. At thy return, if so thou couldst or durst, behold a chaos blacker than the first. Tell him here's worse than a confused matter, his little world's a fathom under water. Not by the fervor of his ardent beams hath power to dry the torrent of these streams. Tell him I would say more, but cannot well, oppressed minds abruptest tales do tell. Now post with double speed, mark what I say, by all our love conjure him not to stay. Bradstreet, as you might be able to tell, was very highly educated and deeply read in the English and classical poetic traditions. And actually, so were many Puritans. But if we take a look at the form that Bradstreet's using, she's writing in heroic couplets, rhymed pairs of iambic pentameter lines. And as you might have guessed, it's called the heroic couplet because it was often used in epics. And it became especially popular actually in the century after Bradstreet. It's pretty similar metrically to the elegy on Stone, but the meter isn't as consistent in Stone's elegy. And thematically, Bradstreet's poem is much more complicated because she weaves together a variety of images and allusions that spill over the couplets and animate the poem as a whole. And the genre that Bradstreet is entering into is the lover's complaint, which isn't a particularly Puritan genre at all. It's what it sounds like, a lover complaining about unrequited affection, lost love, or in this case, separation from their love. Now, the genre was usually written by men giving voice to a female lover. Shakespeare even has one. But in this case, Bradstreet takes over the genre and tells a man, the Greco-Roman god Phoebus, to convey her complaint to her husband. Phoebus, also known as Apollo, pulls the sun across the sky by a golden chariot. And at first, Bradstreet asks him to speed it up. She wants to get to nighttime where it's more acceptable to bewail her loneliness. Later in the poem, she even goes so far as to call herself a widow, imagining that her husband has died and isn't just away for a short period of time. Now, we could also read the lyric subject, the voice that speaks in this poem, not as Bradstreet, but as an imagined person who really is grieving a lost husband. But I'm more inclined to think of this as Bradstreet herself, using hyperbole to describe how lonely she feels. She talks about drowning the world in her tears in this poem. Either way, in the second couplet, she changes her approach, asking Phoebus not to hurry off, but to pause so he can carry a message of grief around the world. But stay this once, and to my suit give ear, and tell my griefs in either hemisphere. And if he can, she asks Phoebus to carry a message directly to her husband. Show him the sorrows of his widowed wife. While Phoebus flies above the sky, she says that her brackish tears are flooding her environs. Tell him that here's worse than a confused matter. His little world's a fathom underwater. By the last line of the poem, or by the last few lines of the poem, Bradstreet shifts the imagery slightly so that her husband becomes the sun that Phoebus pulls. Not but the fervor of his ardent beams hath power to dry the torrent of these streams. And Bradstreet uses this image of the sun to describe her husband in other poems that she has, lamenting his travels far away from home. At the end, in true Puritan wordplay fashion, Bradstreet ends with kind of a pun on postmark. Now, post with double speed, mark what I say, by all our loves conjure him not to stay. At the end, Bradstreet reaffirms her use of the complaint here, asking Phoebus to compel her husband to return by the powers of all our loves. A few lines earlier, she talks about Phoebus going home to see his love, so she could be using all our loves to refer to her love for her husband, Phoebus and his love's love, all the love in the world. She also could be referring to her children, all our loves. So there's much more to say about this poem. It's dramatic, it's funny, and it's filled to the brim with clever turns of phrase. But I'm actually going to end it here so that you might go back to it and read it on your own once, twice, maybe 3 times, practicing that Puritan style of meditative reading. So from Michael Wigglesworth's The Day of Doom to Thomas Shepard's painted poem to the funeral elegies of Samuel Stone and Anne Bradstreet's Lover's Complaint, we've covered a lot of ground across the 17th century and colonial New England. But there's always more to read. So if that Bradstreet poem wasn't enough of a teaser of what you might find if you dig more into Puritan poetry, I'm going to project probably the most unusual of Puritan poems onto the screen here. This is actually a love poem too, and so you can see the manuscript version on the left side and then a typed out version on the right side. It's a love poem written by Edward Taylor to his soon-to-be wife, Elizabeth. It's an acrostic shape poem. So acrostic is when each line begins with either the letter of someone's name or the alphabet. In this case, it's the alphabet down the left side. But the triangle and circle shape is also made up of specific letters that spell out a few different things depending on which way you look. So now acrostic poems were really, really popular with Puritans. A lot of funeral elegies were written as acrostics of the deceased's name. Shaped poems, where the words work together to make a shape, were less so. Edward Taylor was really influenced by English poet George Herbert, who wrote some shaped poems. So I have a suspicion that's where this is coming from. But even Herbert's shaped poems are a bit more accessible than this one. But if we take the things we know about Puritan poetry and the skills of close reading we've been practicing tonight, we might just be able to unlock a bit of what's going on here. In American popular imagination, Puritans are often thought of as buttoned-up prudes and ruiners of a good time. And while it's true that Puritans were moralists and they didn't celebrate Christmas, they also were people. Literacy, as we've discussed, was an important feature of Puritan spirituality. As Protestants, they viewed reading the Bible directly as a necessary means of spiritual development. But that created voracious readers, and they didn't just stop with the Bible. While the separatism of the Plymouth Colony Puritans has led many of us to view New England Puritanism as isolationist, it really wasn't. There's an immense flow of literature, songs, stories, and ideas across the Atlantic throughout the colonial period. And the dividing lines between sacred and secular literatures were not always cut and dry. Sacred poetry borrowed language and form from secular poetry. Puritan scholar David D. Hall puts it this way in his book, Worlds of Wonder, Days of Judgment. Quote, "These were people who eagerly read street ballads on sensational events, but who also treasured Bibles, who slipped off at night to sample dirty books, but who also memorized the contents of a school book with its pious verse and catechism," end quote. Someone's Commonplace book, a journal in which folks could record favorite quotations, poems, Bible verses, might have an excerpt from a bawdy ballad scribbled down next to a prayer or a favorite few lines from the Day of Doom. Even though what ultimately defines Puritanism in the 17th century is a commitment to ongoing religious reform, Puritans read a wide variety of literatures written by authors from a variety of confessions. And all of these things found ways to influence the poetry they wrote, as we saw in these last two examples. Puritan poetry, like Puritan religious practice, is always a delicate balance of wanting to maintain a commitment to the particularities of their faith, but also engage in the poetic traditions that animated the 17th century. I lost my mouse, but that is it.
Thank you, Abigail, for that fascinating lecture that illuminated just the ways the Puritans treated poetry as, among other things, a way to navigate questions about morality and even their own spiritual practices. You showed us very helpfully how the Puritan style, how the plain style in poetry was, although plain, far from simple, and among other things, a way to signal to their larger theological commitments. And this shows up, as you showed, in the narrative poetry and the solemn translations and the elegies and the epitaphs and more. So this was just a really great, beautiful exploration of how the oral textures, the wordplay, the formal patterns all inform the poetry, from the internal rhymes and ballad forms to the context that these forms were enjoyed, including the communal contexts and the domestic contexts, which were fascinating. So thank you for highlighting that. Thank you so much for this informative lecture. I know we'll all have questions or comments, so I will turn it over to the room now for questions and answers.